When I heard the zipper tear across the fabric, I turned and saw him standing in the hallway with my old suitcase open on the bench, the one I keep for trips I never take. He wasn't packing in anger, there was no shouting, no slammed doors, just a steady, methodical movement, like a metronome ticking at a tempo I couldn't slow down. He lifted a folded sweater, then a notebook that wasn't his. He opened it. On the inside cover, there was a small square of paper I had forgotten to remove, 4 bars of a melody sketched in pencil, a note that said, "For the courtyard, when the rain comes." His eyes paused there. He didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. From outside, through the kitchen window, a guitar drifted over the brick and ivy, soft, almost apologetic. He set the paper back with a careful hand, as if it might bruise, and kept packing. I stood with a dish towel still in my palm, pressing it so tight my knuckles ached, wishing for a Messier scene, something with noise and chaos, something I could push back against. Instead there was only the even breath of a man who had measured the distance between what he knew and what he could bear, and chosen the second without a word. The suitcase swallowed another shirt, a small bag of toiletries, the book he reads at night. He looked at me once, not with fury, but with a tired astonishment, like someone finding rain in a room that had always been dry. "It's only music," I almost said. But the room understood what I refused to admit. Music had been the language of everything I hadn't dared to speak. I watched his hands, remembered them steadying my elbow on winter sidewalks, slicing apples in the afternoon, threading a button in a hotel lobby when I'd lost it before a dinner that feels, now, like a previous life. The guitar outside fell silent, and that silence was louder than any accusation. My heart pressed against my ribs, knocking like a late visitor. This careful packing was what I had feared most, because 3 months ago I crossed a line that looked, at first, like a harmless step across a courtyard, and now, let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I have tried so carefully to hide, write in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this: have you ever guarded a truth so gently, only to realize that the quiet you kept around it was what betrayed you first? I wake before the alarm most days, not out of discipline but habit, the kind that grows when years stack neatly like plates in a cupboard. Dawn is not dramatic where we live, it just sidles in, soft and gray, washing the kitchen tiles with a light that makes the grout look cleaner than it is. I fill the kettle, listen for the small, reliable roar as if it were proof that something in the world still obeys me. Across the courtyard, behind the ivy and the pale brick, a guitar sometimes speaks. Not every morning. Not loudly. A line, a reply, a pause. It threads into the steam rising from my mug and the spoon clinking against ceramic and the distant rumble of a bus we never take. I tell myself I listen because the sound is beautiful, and it is. But there's a second reason I won't touch, like a bruise under a sleeve. It's not that my marriage is bad. It would be easier if it were. We have routines that still fit, the shared grocery list on the fridge, the way he warms my side of the bed when I come to it cold, the soft whistle he makes when he tries to find his keys. We don't fight much. We don't do much that inspires fighting. The absence isn't conflict, it's air where touch should be, a missing weight. I do not blame him entirely for it. I know my part. I stopped asking for small tendernesses and told myself it was maturity. Then I stopped noticing I had stopped. He comes into the kitchen as the kettle clicks off, his hair a little flat on one side, the way it always is. He touches my shoulder, a polite touch, grateful for coffee, not a claim or a question. "Morning," he says, and I hear affection in it, the kind that accumulates by staying. We talk about the weather, about a colleague of his who insists on meetings that could be emails, about the neighbor who leaves his trash out on the wrong day. I do not mention the music because to mention it would be to label it, and labels invite handling. When he leaves, he does it efficiently, mug rinsed, shoes found, bag lifted. At the door he says, "Don't forget the service appointment, they'll call after lunch." I nod and lift my mug in a salute that is almost playful. The door closes. The hallway settles. On the counter, the dish towel is folded into a small square. I unfold it and fold it again because my hands need an occupation. Across the courtyard, a phrase unfurls, two notes climbing, one falling, the kind of melody that feels inevitable the moment you hear it, as if it had been waiting in the air for someone to pull it down. I stand by the sink, shameless in my stillness, letting it pass through me. I tell myself that anyone would pause for this. I tell myself it's neighborly to appreciate the arts, that cities are built on small exchanges, borrowed sugar, borrowed sound. The first time I saw him was not in the courtyard. It was 3 months ago in the supermarket, in the aisle where they shelve breakfast cereals and things pretending to be breakfast. He had a guitar case strapped across his back and was comparing labels on jars of honey, one brow tilted as if music and sweetness demanded the same precision. He offered me the shelf space with a small nod. His eyes were the kind that look like a question even when he isn't asking one. I said, "Excuse me," and stepped into his place, choosing the brand my husband prefers without actually seeing it. When I turned, his gaze had slid past me to the window beyond the automatic doors, where rain had started without fanfare. "Seems early," he said, as if weather reports were personal. "It'll pass," I said, as if I knew. 2 days later, I heard the guitar in the courtyard for the first time. The kitchen window was cracked for air, a strand of ivy had managed to thread itself into the frame, a stubborn green signature on white paint. The sound came tentative, like a neighbor knocking lightly so as not to disturb. I froze, caught between the desire to close the window and the urge to open it fully. I opened it. The breeze lifted the corner of a recipe clipped to the fridge with a magnet, something with lemon and thyme I had meant to try. The music filled the room without asking permission. I did not ask for its name. Some beauties are easier to carry unnamed. It began the way a routine does, once, then again, then often enough to anticipate. Not loud. Not daily. Sometimes a run of notes at noon, sometimes at 3 or at 5, threading itself through the day's errands, the pharmacy, the dry cleaner, the phone call with my sister about whether we are becoming our mother in ways we swore we wouldn't. I kept a notebook near the kettle, ostensibly for grocery lists, but I started to scribble a word or two when the guitar did something I didn't have the vocabulary for: blue glass, late sun, stairs down. The notebook became a small, private complicity with sound. The first exchange across the fence was ridiculously ordinary. I was hanging laundry on the line because I prefer the smell to the dryer's warm sameness. He came into his courtyard with a mug and saw me only when he'd already committed to being there. A brief hesitation, a visible decision not to retreat. "Morning," he said. His voice matched the guitar, low, unhurried. "Morning," I answered, pinning a pillowcase and pretending my heart wasn't performing small foolishnesses. He lifted his mug slightly. "I'm working on something," he added, as if he owed an explanation for sound. "It suits the bricks." I nodded. "They keep secrets," I said, surprising myself. He laughed, not loudly. It was not flirting. It was not anything that could be quoted later in an argument. It was two neighbors acknowledging the existence of a thing both could hear. That afternoon my husband texted me a photograph from his office, a new plant on his windowsill, the kind with leaves that look like coins. "Insurance against budget cuts," he wrote. I replied with a thumbs up and then, guilty at my laziness, added, "Looks lucky." He responded with a heart. I stared at the screen, at the tidy exchange of icons, at the way affection had learned to commute via shorthand. When he came home, we made dinner side by side, a quiet choreography. He chopped, I stirred, he salted, I tasted. He asked about the service appointment. I reported that the mechanic had been on time and charming. We watched a documentary about a city we'll probably never visit. Before bed, he touched my cheek and said, "You okay?" I said, "Yes," because at that exact moment I was. He turned off the light. The room softened around us. Sleep can be generous or stingy. That night it counted each minute before granting the next. I lay there listening to the small noises that make a house feel alive, the refrigerator's shy cough, a pipe somewhere clearing its throat, the wind negotiating with the ivy. And under it, faint as if memory had its own frequency, I thought I heard the guitar again, or some echo of it, a phrase that suggested questions I had not yet allowed myself to ask. I pressed my fingers to the sheet, feeling the weave, the tiny prickle where a thread had loosened. It grounded me in something honest, the material fact of a life built together, laundered together, worn into softness together. In the morning, I took the notebook from beside the kettle and drew 4 small boxes in a row, measures, I suppose, though I am no musician. In the first 2 I wrote nothing, because sometimes the absence is the part you remember. In the 3rd I wrote, courtyard, rain. In the 4th, answer later. It wasn't a map, only a promise to myself that I would pay attention, that I would not sleepwalk through the days as if they were all the same length. If there were a hinge where the door of my life began to loosen, it was small, almost invisible. It was me walking through the courtyard that afternoon instead of around it, because the mailbox is on that side and habit had momentarily stepped aside. It was the way the light pooled near the drain after a morning shower had rinsed the brick, a shallow sky you could step into. It was him sitting on the back step, the guitar upright against his shoulder, not playing, just holding it the way you hold a thought you're not yet ready to share. "Good timing," he said, nodding at the sky. "It always clears for the second act." I smiled without meaning to. "Then I'm late for the first." He shook his head. "The overture's in the walls." I didn't stay. I didn't need to. We exchanged the kind of remarks you forget word for word but remember in contour. I carried the mail back across the wet bricks, the envelopes acquiring a faint damp curl at the edges. Inside, I set them on the table and did not open them. I stood at the sink and washed an already clean glass because I wanted the feel of warm water on my hands. Through the window, beyond the ivy, he began to play, and for the first time I felt the shape of the notes as if they were tracing something in me I hadn't permitted a name. I lifted the notebook and wrote a single sentence, "If there is a beginning, it is not where I thought." Rain began just after noon, sudden enough to catch me in the open courtyard with a small bag of recycling in my hands. By the time I reached the bins, the drops had thickened into lines, forcing me to turn back. The awning between our 2 back doors was the nearest shelter, narrow and low, vines curling over its edges like a curtain. Water drummed above me, carrying the smell of wet brick and soil. He was already there, sitting on the step with his guitar case beside him. Without a word, he shifted so I could stand in the dry space. We both faced the rain, letting it speak for us. The cold crept into my sleeves. Noticing, he nudged a steaming mug toward me. "Tea," he said simply. I wrapped my hands around the ceramic, letting the heat soak in, careful not to make the gesture seem like more than it was. The guitar case rested between his knees. "Can't play in this," he said, almost to himself. "The rain drowns it." I smiled. "And wins." His brief laugh rose and fell quickly, like a match's flame. The rain swelled, each drop meeting the courtyard with a soft, insistent slap. A truck's siren wailed far away, closer, the ivy hung heavy and dark against the wall. "I've been working on something," he said after a while. "It keeps breaking when I push it too far." I suggested maybe it wasn't meant to be bigger. He tilted his head, considering. "Smaller might survive." His gaze returned to the rain. We stood quietly, the air between us warm from the tea in close quarters. A gust pushed the rain inward. I reached to steady the awning's edge just as he did. Our fingers brushed, a brief contact neither of us commented on. "I heard you last night," I said. "Around 9. The part that climbs, then refuses to land." He nodded. "That's the trouble, it doesn't want to come home." I suggested letting it linger, unfinished. He said nothing, but I felt the idea settle. When he turned toward me, it wasn't sudden, but enough to place my face under his attention. I took a sip of tea to steady myself. "I don't usually give people tea," he said. "I don't usually take it," I replied. The exchange felt like a line crossed without ceremony. A scooter splashed through the alley, then coughed its way back to life. The sound faded, leaving only the steady rhythm above us. Without thinking, I said, "I used to dance." He asked nothing more, just offered his own piece. "I used to play too much, places that didn't deserve it. I'm keeping what still feels honest." We shared a small nod, an acknowledgement without conclusion. The tea cooled. We stood close because the awning was small, because the rain pressed us inward. My shoulder brushed his arm. He glanced at my hand, at the ring's pale circle on my skin. He asked nothing. "I like the doorway idea," he said, returning to our earlier thread. "It's less final," I agreed. "You can always step in or out." A sudden downpour hammered the awning, forcing us to lean toward each other. The curtain of water fell hard enough to blur the rest of the world. Our eyes met, our movements matched without planning. We kissed. It lasted only a moment. No declarations, no promises, just the sound of the rain keeping time. I stepped back first, he followed, as if we had both remembered the rules. "I should go," I said evenly. "Right," he answered. I handed him the mug without our fingers touching. I tucked a wet strand of hair behind my ear, annoyed by how practiced the gesture felt. I waited until the rain eased to a steady patter before crossing the courtyard. Inside, I slipped off my shoes and hung my sweater over a chair. In the mirror, I looked like someone returned from the weather, changed in a way a towel couldn't fix. I moved through the rest of the afternoon as if nothing required attention, checked the calendar for the service call, answered a message from my sister, wiped the kitchen counter. At 4, the mechanic phoned to say he'd be late. I told him it was fine, surprised by the steadiness of my voice. By 5, the rain had stopped, though water still dripped from leaves and eaves. My husband texted to ask if I needed anything from the store. I typed no, then maybe lemons, then deleted both and settled on all good. I set the phone face down and pressed my palms to the table, feeling the grain like a map of roads I had walked without noticing. As evening softened the courtyard, I stood by the window and looked toward the step where we had sheltered. The mug was gone. The guitar case was gone. Only a puddle shaped like a fallen leaf remained. I closed the curtains and switched on the lamp. Light filled the room without questions. I told myself tomorrow I would be better at being ordinary. I told myself it could be contained by refusing to name it. The house listened in its usual silence. The morning after the rain felt unusually still, the courtyard washed clean and smelling faintly of damp earth. Sunlight pushed through the thin gaps in the curtains, striping the kitchen table in narrow bars. I filled the kettle and stood by the counter, waiting for the sound of water beginning to stir, but another sound came first, silence where I expected music. I told myself he might be sleeping in, or gone out early. The absence sat in the air like an unfinished sentence. I tried to settle into the rhythm of the day. There was laundry to fold, the sink to clear, and a grocery list to write before the weekend. Yet my eyes kept sliding to the window, checking the far wall for any sign of movement. By mid-morning, the space remained empty. I put on my jacket and decided to walk to the bakery under the pretense of kneading bread, though we still had half a loaf. The route took me past the corner where the ivy spilled down over the brick, hiding most of his doorway. It was shut, a faint trace of water still darkening the bottom step. Inside the bakery, the line was short. I took my place and glanced around more than I needed to. When I finally saw him, it was in the reflection of the glass display, standing 2 people behind me. He was holding a sheet of paper folded into thirds, the top edge softened from handling. I looked away before our eyes could meet. The line moved quickly. When I paid, I lingered by the rack of small pastries, pretending to decide. He stepped forward, ordered a coffee, and for a moment we shared the space in that narrow aisle. "Morning," he said quietly, almost neutral. "Morning," I replied. It was neither warm nor cold, simply the temperature required for public air. I left first, the bag of bread warm against my palm. Outside, the sky was already shifting, clouds gathering in slow sheets. At the corner, I glanced back. He was at the counter adding sugar to his coffee, head bent. I turned away before he could look up. The walk home felt longer than usual, each step measured as though I might be followed, though I knew I wouldn't be. Back inside, I set the bread on the counter and checked my phone. A message from my husband waited, a photograph of a stack of reports and the caption, "Long day ahead." I replied with a simple, "Don't work too hard." The exchange was efficient, stripped of anything unnecessary. I stood for a while in the middle of the kitchen, bread still in its paper sleeve, the window in my peripheral vision like a low hum. Outside, the courtyard remained still. Around noon, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. The knock that followed was light, almost uncertain. I opened the door to find my neighbor from 2 floors down, holding a small pot with a plant barely sprouting. She said she was going away for a week and asked if I could water it. I agreed, grateful for something to occupy my hands. After she left, I placed the pot by the window where the light was steady. Its leaves were so pale they seemed almost transparent. The rest of the afternoon unfolded without urgency. I answered a few emails, reorganized the spice drawer, wiped the table twice though it was already clean. From the courtyard, the occasional sound of footsteps passed by, none of them his. It was only toward the late afternoon that I heard the faint scrape of a chair against stone, followed by the low start of a guitar string being tuned. I stood by the sink, holding the sponge in midair, waiting for the first line. It came tentative, single notes spaced apart, like stones placed carefully across a stream. I listened without moving until the kettle's whistle broke the spell. At some point, the playing stopped. I poured tea and sat at the table, notebook open, pen resting across the page. My intention was to make the grocery list I'd postponed all day, but instead I wrote down a single phrase, "Not all silences are the same." I didn't know yet what I meant by it, only that the morning's silence had been different from this one. By evening, the courtyard's light had thinned to a soft gray. I stepped outside to bring in the laundry, though most of it was still damp from the night before. The air smelled faintly metallic, a sign that rain might come again. Across the way, his door opened. He stepped out with a small bouquet of wildflowers, imperfect, stems uneven, colors mismatched. He caught my eye and lifted them slightly in greeting. "For you," he said. My first thought was to refuse, but I took them, their stems cool against my fingers. "They were by the fence," he added, as if to explain their origin. I thanked him, my voice more formal than I intended. Back inside, I placed the flowers in a jar and set them on the counter. The kitchen took on a new smell, faintly green and earthy. My husband came home later than usual, shaking his head at the traffic. We ate a simple dinner, soup and bread, and talked about the latest news, the neighbor's leaking pipe, a friend of his who had just retired. I didn't mention the flowers. They sat behind me in their jar, catching the overhead light in small glints. When he went to the living room to read, I stayed in the kitchen, clearing dishes and wiping down the counter. Outside, the courtyard had gone completely dark. I stood at the window for a long moment, the reflection of the flowers superimposed on the black glass, the faint scent of rain beginning to rise again. The following day carried a restless edge from the start. I woke earlier than usual, the sky outside still a dull wash of gray, the air in the room feeling heavier than it should. My husband's side of the bed was already empty. I could hear the muffled sounds of him moving through his morning routine, the clink of a cup set down, the soft thud of a door closing. When he left for work, the apartment fell into the kind of quiet that magnifies every small sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of a floorboard under my step. I tried to busy myself with chores. The plant from the neighbor downstairs needed water, so I filled a small jug and poured carefully until the soil darkened. Outside the window, the courtyard was empty except for a lone sparrow picking at the damp ground. I kept glancing toward the far wall, half expecting the scrape of a chair or the low hum of tuning strings, but nothing came. The stillness unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. By mid-morning, I decided to take a walk. The park was only a few blocks away, and the air smelled of rain that had passed in the night. The paths were slick, and puddles reflected the bare branches of trees just beginning to hint at green. As I rounded a bend near the old gazebo, I saw him sitting on a bench, the guitar case beside him, head tilted slightly as if listening to something only he could hear. He noticed me before I could decide whether to approach. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between welcome and hesitation. I sat at the far end of the bench, leaving a polite space between us. For a while, we watched the slow movement of clouds across the sky. "You walk here often?" he asked after a time. I told him I did, though not always at this hour. He nodded, as if filing the information away. A child's laughter drifted across the park from the playground, then faded again. He rested one hand on the guitar case but didn't open it. "Sometimes the air feels too heavy for music," he said. I understood without asking for explanation. We stayed there longer than I intended. The breeze shifted, carrying the smell of wet leaves and something faintly metallic from the gazebo's rusted frame. A couple passed by, the woman glancing briefly in our direction before looking away. That small look was enough to remind me of the boundaries we stood near, whether or not we chose to cross them. I stood first, brushing a bit of damp from my coat. He remained seated, offering only a quiet take care as I left. On the walk back, I replayed the scene in my mind, every pause and glance weighted with more meaning than it probably held. By the time I reached the apartment, the day had shifted into early afternoon. I made lunch, ate standing at the counter, and considered what to do next. The rain began again, a thin, steady fall that blurred the outlines of the courtyard. Through the misted glass, I thought I saw him carry something from his doorway to the small table under the awning, a notebook, perhaps, or sheet music. The sight stirred a pull in me, but I stayed where I was. Later, while sorting through the mail, I found an envelope addressed in an unfamiliar hand. Inside was a flyer for a small evening performance at a cafe a few streets over. The date was for that very night. There was no name on it, but the simple illustration of a guitar in the corner left little doubt. I set it on the table and stared at it longer than necessary before tucking it under a stack of newspapers. When my husband returned home, he mentioned a meeting scheduled late into the evening, and I nodded without comment. He poured himself a glass of water, asked about my day, and I gave him the safe version: laundry, a walk in the park, the neighbor's plant doing well. He didn't press for more. After dinner, he left again, briefcase in hand, the scent of his cologne lingering in the hallway after the door closed. The apartment felt larger in his absence. I moved from room to room, switching off lights until only the one in the kitchen remained. The flyer still sat beneath the newspapers. I pulled it out and read the details again. The cafe wasn't far, I could be back before he was. I told myself it was just music, just a seat in a public place, nothing that would leave a mark. Still, I hesitated. In the end, I didn't go. Instead, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, listening to the rain and imagining the sound of guitar strings being plucked somewhere a few streets away. The flowers from 2 days ago still stood in their jar on the counter, stems leaning slightly now, petals curling at the edges. I thought about replacing them, then decided against it. Some things are better left to fade in their own time. Outside, the courtyard glistened under the rain, empty but for the quiet drip of water from the awning's edge. The morning began without rain, though the air carried the dampness of recent storms. Sunlight pooled unevenly across the kitchen floor, filtered through the leaves of the potted plant on the windowsill. I boiled water for coffee, the familiar hiss and click of the kettle filling the quiet. My husband left earlier than usual, mentioning a meeting out of town. I nodded, barely looking up from the mug in my hands. The door closed with its usual muted thud, and the apartment settled into stillness. I decided to walk to the market. The air outside was cool, the sky a pale blue with streaks of thin clouds. The path took me past the courtyard, where I noticed his door half open. For a moment I slowed, but continued on without pausing. At the market, I moved between stalls of vegetables and bread, listening to the soft chatter of vendors. I bought a loaf, some apples, and a bundle of fresh herbs, the scent of them following me all the way home. When I returned, he was standing near the ivy-covered wall, tuning his guitar. The sound was faint at first, a few low notes checking their place. He saw me approach and offered a small nod. I stopped without thinking, adjusting the bag in my hand. "You went out early," I said. He smiled faintly. "Needed to find something." I didn't ask what. The sun caught in the metal tuning pegs as he adjusted another string, the note rising until it matched the one in his ear. We stood there for a moment, neither moving. The scent of the herbs in my bag mixed with the faint tang of varnish from his guitar. A breeze lifted the edge of my coat. He glanced at the bag and said, "Looks like you found something too." I looked down at the bread and apples, suddenly aware of how ordinary the contents were. "Just the usual," I replied. He strummed once, softly, and the chord seemed to linger longer than it should. A neighbor's voice called from somewhere above, breaking the moment. I shifted my weight and took a small step toward the stairs, but he spoke again before I could turn away. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. My instinct was to refuse, but I didn't. Instead, I set the bag on the low wall and waited. He reached into his case and pulled out a sheet of music, handwritten in dark pencil, notes scattered like marks on a map. "It's almost finished," he said. "But it needs something." I took the page without touching his hand, scanning the uneven lines. "Maybe let it breathe more between phrases," I suggested. He looked at me, then nodded slowly, as if weighing the thought. We talked briefly about music and how silence inside a song can matter more than the notes themselves. His eyes met mine when he said it, and I felt the air shift between us. Without planning it, we stepped closer. There was no one else in the courtyard. We kissed. The contact was brief, measured, almost deliberate in its restraint. No words followed. I picked up my bag, and he returned the page to his case. The moment folded into the day as though it had always been part of it. Inside, the apartment felt slightly warmer than before. I unpacked the groceries, arranging the apples in a bowl, placing the bread on the counter. The herbs went into a jar of water. I washed my hands twice, though there was no real reason to. The clock on the wall marked the minutes in quiet clicks. Outside, the sound of his guitar resumed, soft, deliberate, as if testing the spaces between each note. The rest of the afternoon passed in small, careful tasks. I swept the kitchen floor, answered 2 emails, and folded the laundry from the day before. Each action felt both ordinary and slightly detached, as though I were watching myself perform them. At some point, the guitar stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps receding down the alley. Evening came slowly. The light in the courtyard turned gold, catching in the ivy and along the bricks. I stood at the window, looking out without focusing on anything specific. The flowers he had given me days earlier still stood on the counter, petals now edged in brown. I thought of replacing them but didn't. The air smelled faintly of bread and herbs, and beneath it, something else I couldn't name. When my husband returned later than expected, he mentioned traffic and a late lunch with colleagues. I listened, nodding where it felt appropriate. We ate dinner together, simple soup, bread torn in pieces. Conversation stayed in safe territory, weather, errands, the possibility of repainting the hallway. Afterward, he read in the living room while I tidied the kitchen. Outside, the courtyard was quiet again. I switched off the lights one by one, leaving only the soft glow above the sink. The glass reflected my face and, faintly, the outline of the flowers behind me. I stood there for a while, hands resting on the counter, until the sound of a page turning in the next room reminded me that the day had ended, though not entirely. The next day began with the low hum of wind moving through the courtyard, rattling the ivy against the brick. I stood at the window with my coffee, watching the shadows shift as clouds moved over the sun. The guitar had been silent since the afternoon before, and the quiet felt heavier than it should. My husband left in his usual way, coat over one arm, a half-smile as he reminded me about a package being delivered. When the door closed, the apartment took on its familiar stillness. I spent the morning moving between small tasks, wiping down the counters, sorting receipts, taking the neighbor's plant to the sink for water. Each action was measured, a way to keep from dwelling on the pause and sound outside. Around midday, the delivery arrived, a box I had been expecting for weeks. I opened it at the kitchen table, peeling away the layers of tape until the contents were revealed, new linens for the bedroom, the fabric crisp and faintly scented from storage. I set them aside to wash later, though the urge to change them immediately was strong. It was mid-afternoon before I saw him again. I had stepped into the courtyard to shake out the dust cloth, and he was there, setting a small black case on the low wall near his door. The case was not for the guitar but for something smaller, which he opened to reveal a compact recording device and a pair of worn headphones. He looked up briefly, acknowledged me with a nod, then returned to adjusting the settings. I found myself asking, working on something new? The question felt casual, but the way he looked at me made it seem more pointed. Just trying to catch something before it disappears, he said. I didn't ask what that meant. A neighbor passed through the courtyard carrying a folded umbrella, glancing between us before disappearing into the stairwell. He returned his attention to the device, tapping a button, then strumming a muted chord on the guitar propped against the wall. The sound was faint, just enough to register. I lingered, watching as he repeated the chord, adjusting the placement of the microphone. At one point, he handed me the headphones without explanation. I hesitated, then put them on. The sound was clean, the notes sharper than they ever seemed in the open air, each vibration distinct. I listened longer than necessary before removing them and passing them back. We spoke little after that. I went inside, but the image of him bent over the equipment stayed with me. From my kitchen, I could see him in glimpses through the ivy, his hands moving, the light shifting across his shoulders as the afternoon thinned toward evening. At some point, the music stopped, replaced by the quiet scrape of the case being closed. Later, just as the sky began to dim, there was a knock at my door. It was soft, deliberate. When I opened it, he stood there holding a folded piece of paper. "For you," he said simply. I took it without unfolding it, thanked him, and he left without waiting for a response. I closed the door, leaning against it for a moment before sitting at the table to open the note. Inside was a single line, written in a steady hand, "If you want to hear it as it's meant to be, come tonight." I set the paper down and stared at it. The meaning was clear, yet I told myself it was an invitation to music, nothing else. My husband had mentioned he would be working late, so there was no conflict of schedules, but the decision still felt weighted. I moved through the evening routine with mechanical precision, preparing a light meal, washing the new linens, tidying the kitchen, while the note remained in plain view on the counter. When the clock reached the time he had written, I found myself standing at my own door with a sweater draped over my shoulders. The courtyard was quiet, the bricks still holding the day's warmth. His door was ajar. I stepped inside without knocking, drawn by the soft glow of a lamp and the faint scent of coffee. The guitar rested on a stand beside the chair, the recording device set up again, ready. He gestured toward the seat opposite his. No words were exchanged as he began to play. The sound filled the space in a way it never had outside, every note precise, every pause intentional. It was not a performance for a crowd but something smaller, directed entirely toward me. I sat without moving, letting the music carry through the room, through me. When it ended, there was a moment of stillness, neither of us speaking. He reached over to stop the recording, the click of the button loud in the quiet. We spent the next few minutes in an easy silence, the kind that feels less like absence and more like agreement. I stood to leave, and he didn't follow me to the door. Outside, the night air was cooler, the courtyard shadowed. I walked back to my apartment slowly, the notes of his song still moving through my mind long after I closed my own door behind me. The following morning arrived with a brightness that felt almost at odds with the weight in my chest. Sunlight poured into the kitchen, casting sharp rectangles on the floor. I moved through the routine without thinking, kettle filled, bread sliced, the quiet between each step loud enough to make me notice it. My husband left with a brief mention of dinner plans with colleagues. He kissed my cheek lightly, a gesture that had become as habitual as locking the door behind him. When he was gone, the apartment seemed to take a deeper breath, settling into that peculiar calm it held only when I was alone. I spent the first part of the day attending to practical things. The linens I had washed the night before were folded and put away. I sorted through a drawer in the hallway, discarding expired receipts and outdated letters. The neighbor's plant was thriving, its leaves had grown more opaque since she'd left it in my care. Outside, the courtyard was still, the bricks holding on to the last of the early sun's warmth. No music reached me, though I found myself listening for it. By early afternoon, restlessness pushed me out the door. I took the long route to the grocery store, looping through quieter streets where the pavement still glistened in shaded patches from last night's rain. The walk was deliberate, each step a way to stretch the hours until evening without feeling as though I was waiting for something. I bought only what I could carry easily: milk, a small block of cheese, a paper bag of pears that bruised if handled too roughly. As I headed home, the wind shifted, carrying a faint thread of guitar from somewhere ahead. When I turned into the courtyard, he was standing near the ivy wall, adjusting the strap of his guitar. The sound stopped as soon as he saw me, replaced by a pause that seemed to hang between us. I walked closer without quite meaning to. "I didn't hear you earlier," I said. "I was out," he replied, his tone light but not careless. He glanced toward the steps of his doorway, then back at me. "Do you have time?" It was a question framed as casually as possible, yet it landed heavier than the words themselves. I hesitated only a moment before nodding. Inside his place, the light was softer, filtered through curtains the color of pale sand. A table against the wall held the recording device, now switched off, and a half-empty cup of coffee. The guitar leaned within arm's reach. He motioned for me to sit, and I did, setting my bag of groceries on the floor beside the chair. He began to play without introduction, notes strung together in a way that was both unfamiliar and somehow already known. The melody was different from what I'd heard before, more deliberate, with longer pauses between phrases. It drew the room in tighter, each sound held in place as if reluctant to leave. When the song ended, neither of us moved for a moment. Then he set the guitar aside and reached for the coffee, taking a small sip before speaking. "It's better when there's someone listening," he said, almost matter of fact. I didn't answer. Words felt unnecessary. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, the faint sound of its tires on wet asphalt the only intrusion. We sat in silence for a while, the kind that doesn't demand to be broken. My eyes wandered to the windowsill, where a small row of glass jars caught the light. Each held something different: buttons, old coins, a handful of dried seeds. The arrangement seemed deliberate, like a series of small markers for moments only he knew. I found myself wanting to ask about them, but stopped before the question left my mouth. Eventually, I stood, aware of the time. He didn't protest, only watched as I picked up the bag from the floor. At the door, I paused briefly, not because there was anything left to say, but because stepping out meant stepping back into the version of the day that had been waiting without me. Outside, the courtyard was exactly as it had been, yet it felt different in ways I couldn't name. The walk back to my apartment was short, but I noticed every detail: the uneven bricks underfoot, the way the ivy cast moving shadows in the breeze, the distant sound of children playing somewhere beyond the block. Inside, I placed the groceries on the counter and unpacked them slowly, as though prolonging the act could hold the afternoon in place. I washed one of the pears and sliced it onto a plate, eating the pieces without really tasting them. As evening approached, the light in the apartment shifted, becoming warmer, more contained. My husband sent a short message saying he would be late, no further explanation offered. I replied with a simple acknowledgement, placing the phone face down on the table. Outside, the courtyard slipped into shadow, the outlines of the bricks softening. I stood at the window, the faint echo of the day still moving through me, and let the quiet settle like something I had been expecting all along. When the sky turned fully dark, I closed the curtains and switched on the small lamp by the counter. The light pooled in a way that left the rest of the room in shadow, a pocket of brightness surrounded by stillness. I moved through the kitchen, setting things in order for the night, each gesture unhurried. The apartment held its calm, and I let it. Somewhere in the quiet, I knew the day had shifted, though it would take time before I could see exactly how. The next morning was overcast, the light coming through the curtains muted and soft. I woke to the sound of rain starting again, a thin, steady drizzle tapping against the window. My husband was already dressed, standing in the hallway tying his shoes. He told me he had an early meeting, his voice calm and even, and was gone before the kettle finished boiling. I stood at the kitchen counter holding my mug, watching the steam rise and dissolve into the air, the sound of the rain steady in the background. The day moved slowly. I busied myself with simple tasks, wiping down shelves, sweeping the floors, organizing the cupboard where jars and tins had been pushed to the back. The neighbor's plant had grown taller, its leaves leaned toward the window, drinking in the pale light. Outside, the courtyard was empty except for the slow drip of water from the awning. I caught myself listening for the familiar strum of guitar, but it didn't come. By mid-morning, I decided to walk to the post office to send a small package I had been meaning to mail. The streets were wet, the air heavy with the smell of rain-soaked pavement. I passed shop windows fogged from the warmth inside, the reflection of my coat blurred by the glass. At the post office, the line moved slowly, each person speaking in low tones as if the weather itself had dampened their voices. When my turn came, I handed over the package, accepted the receipt, and stepped back into the damp air. On the way home, I took a different route, one that circled back toward the park. The rain had thinned to a mist by then, the path slick but quiet. I saw no one until I neared the old gazebo. He was there, leaning against the railing with his guitar case resting at his side, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. He didn't seem surprised to see me. I stopped a few feet away, my hands tucked into my pockets. You're out early, I said. Couldn't stay in, he replied, glancing briefly at the sky. Sometimes the air's better here. We didn't speak much after that. The silence between us was not awkward, but it was weighted, the kind that holds more than it shows. A jogger passed, the rhythm of their shoes breaking the stillness for a moment before fading again. I stepped closer to the gazebo, resting my hand lightly on the cool wood of the railing. He didn't move, but his attention shifted, as if he was aware of every small motion. After a while, he picked up the guitar case but didn't open it. I've been working on something, he said. It's different. His tone carried a quiet certainty. I nodded, though I didn't ask to hear it. The rain began again, light at first, then heavier, and we stepped back under the shelter. The sound of it filled the space, making conversation unnecessary. We stood there until the worst of it passed, the street beyond the park blurring under the downpour. When I finally turned to leave, he said only, "Take care." I walked home through the wet streets, the sound of the rain chasing me all the way to the courtyard. His door was closed when I passed, no light showing through the curtain. Inside my apartment, I hung my coat to dry and set the receipt from the post office on the counter. The apartment smelled faintly of coffee and damp wool. The rest of the afternoon was quiet. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the courtyard darken as clouds thickened overhead. Around 4, I heard faint movement, footsteps, the creak of a door, but no music followed. Instead, the sound faded, replaced by the rain's steady pattern. I returned to the kitchen, cutting a pear into thin slices, arranging them on a plate without much thought. The act was slow, deliberate, as if the precision of it might anchor me. Evening came without ceremony. My husband sent a short message, a simple note saying he'd be home later than planned. I read it twice before replying, then set the phone face down on the table. Outside, the rain continued, the courtyard glistening under the dim glow of the lone light above the stairwell. I stood there for a long time, the sound of water against brick a constant, unchanging presence, as the night settled in quietly around me. The morning began with a stillness that felt deliberate, as if the air itself was holding something back. I moved through the motions of breakfast without noticing the taste of the coffee or the sound of the spoon against the cup. My husband left in silence, a kind that was not unusual but today felt more final. He carried a small overnight bag, explaining only that he might not be back until late evening. I nodded, the words passing between us like objects set down carefully to avoid noise. After he left, the apartment felt larger than it should. The rooms held a faint chill, the kind that comes from more than just the weather. I watered the neighbor's plant, adjusted its position so the leaves caught more light, then stood at the window looking out over the courtyard. The bricks were dry, the ivy unmoving in the still air. His door was closed, curtains drawn, no sound breaking the quiet. I decided to go for a walk, not with any destination in mind, but to move through the day instead of sitting in it. The streets were calm, the occasional car passing slowly, its tires humming against the asphalt. I passed familiar shopfronts, their displays unchanged from the week before, and the faint smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery. I didn't go in. The thought of speaking, even briefly, felt heavier than it should. When I returned, a suitcase sat near the entrance to the courtyard. It was his, the dark fabric worn smooth at the corners. My husband was there, standing beside it. His expression was neither angry nor rushed, it was quiet, steady, as though whatever decision he had made no longer needed words. He looked at me once, not searching for an explanation, not offering one. Then he walked past, the wheels of the suitcase whispering over the uneven stones, and turned out of sight. I stayed where I was until the sound faded completely. The courtyard felt different, stripped of its usual sounds. A light wind moved through the ivy, the leaves shifting against the wall. I went inside, closing the door behind me. The apartment seemed unchanged, yet every corner felt altered. On the table was a set of keys, his. They were placed neatly, as if to remove any question of intent. I sat for a while without moving, the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides. Eventually, I stood and walked through the rooms, noting the spaces where his things had been. The coat hook by the door was empty except for mine. A gap in the bookshelf marked where a row of paperbacks had been. The absence was exact, deliberate. By afternoon, I had opened the windows to let in the cool air. The courtyard below was quiet except for the occasional sound of footsteps passing through. At one point, I heard the faint scrape of a chair against stone and looked down to see him, the neighbor, sitting with his guitar. He wasn't playing, just holding it loosely across his lap, gaze fixed on the far wall. He looked up, saw me at the window, and gave a brief nod. I returned it before stepping back. The rest of the day moved in uneven stretches of time. I made tea but let it cool on the counter, untouched. I started folding laundry, then stopped halfway, leaving the basket on the chair. The apartment seemed to absorb the unfinished tasks without complaint. Outside, the light shifted toward evening, the shadows in the courtyard lengthening. Near sunset, I heard the first notes of the guitar. They were slow, measured, the pauses between them longer than usual. I stood at the window again, watching him play. The melody was unfamiliar but carried a weight I recognized. It filled the courtyard without pressing against it, as if it knew where the edges were. When it ended, he sat in stillness for a moment, then placed the guitar gently in its case and disappeared inside. As night settled, I closed the windows and drew the curtains. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that has layers, what is absent, what is unspoken, and what is waiting. I moved through the rooms, switching off lights, until only the one in the kitchen remained. The jar of flowers on the counter had begun to wilt, their stems bent under their own weight. I thought about replacing them, but left them as they were. Some endings don't need to be tidied away. The morning after he left was quiet in a way that felt almost deliberate, as though the walls had agreed to hold back any sound. Light crept in slowly through the curtains, pale and thin. I stayed in bed longer than usual, listening to the muted hum of the city beyond the window. When I finally rose, the apartment's stillness followed me from room to room. The absence was everywhere, on the empty hook where his coat had hung, in the space on the dresser where his watch used to rest. Even the air felt different, cooler somehow. I made coffee without thinking, the actions automatic, measure, pour, wait for the slow drip. The smell filled the kitchen but did little to warm it. The flowers on the counter had wilted further overnight, their petals curled inward, the stems leaning toward the jar's edge. I turned them slightly, as though a different angle might help, but it didn't. The neighbor's plant on the windowsill looked healthier than anything else in the room, its leaves reaching for the faint light. From the window, the courtyard seemed unchanged, though the bricks still glistened faintly from last night's rain. His door was closed, the curtain inside drawn. I stood there longer than I meant to, half expecting it to open, half relieved it didn't. The day stretched out ahead of me without a clear shape. There were no errands that couldn't wait, no tasks urgent enough to require my full attention. I moved slowly through the apartment, tidying here and there, folding a blanket, stacking clean dishes, wiping down the already clean table. By midday, the sky had cleared, the light sharpening in the courtyard. I opened the windows to let in the cool air. Somewhere down the block, someone was playing music on a radio, faint and distant. I made tea and carried it to the table, where I sat without drinking it, watching the shadows shift as the sun moved. Time passed in uneven stretches, sometimes quickly, sometimes as though it had stopped altogether. It was mid-afternoon when I heard it, guitar strings, faint but distinct. I moved to the window instinctively. He was outside, seated near the ivy wall, the guitar resting easily in his hands. The melody was slow, almost tentative, with pauses that let the air settle before the next note. I leaned against the frame, out of sight, letting the sound fill the space between us. He didn't look toward my window, didn't acknowledge that I might be listening. When the piece ended, he stayed there a moment longer, then placed the guitar in its case and disappeared inside. The rest of the day passed quietly. I made a simple dinner for myself, eating at the kitchen table while the light faded outside. The air cooled quickly, and I closed the windows against the evening breeze. The jar of flowers caught my eye again, the water inside cloudy, the stems bent low. I thought about throwing them away, but instead, I left them where they were. They seemed to belong to this version of the apartment, one in which things were left as they were found, not fixed or replaced. After dark, the courtyard was lit only by the small lamp above the stairwell. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the stillness below. No doors opened, no footsteps crossed the bricks. The ivy barely moved in the faint wind. Behind me, the apartment was dim, the only light coming from the lamp over the sink. I stayed there until the cold from the glass began to seep into my hands. When I finally turned away, I moved through the apartment, switching off the last of the lights. In the bedroom, the bed looked wider than it had before. I lay down and listened to the quiet, the kind that settles deep enough to touch everything. Outside, the night held steady, and I let it, knowing that whatever shape the days took from here on would be different, even if the walls and windows stayed the same.